Hey there. So today I'm lucky to be joined by Khaled Elgindy, the director of the program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. And he's a former advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah. Khaled, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I mean, how are you feeling? What have these past few weeks been like for you?
To be honest, the past few weeks have been quite traumatic. Obviously, the horrific attacks on October 7th, and then followed by more horror for another almost 4 weeks now. Gaza's been under constant bombardment without food and water and fuel and basic necessities of life. And at least 9,000 have been killed in Gaza, and almost half of them are children. Almost 4,000 children have been killed, which is, to me, is just unimaginable. And the scale of destruction is quite enormous. And what is most disturbing is that there doesn't appear to be any end in sight. It's quite horrible. I can't remember a time that was this horrible in the Israel-Palestine arena.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that there's no clear end in sight. And that said, there's been a lot of commentary, a lot of questions about, the day after, the day when that end comes. That is the day after Israel achieves its stated goal of eliminating Hamas as an entity in the Gaza Strip. I want to get back to that question later on, but I think for the purposes of our conversation, I want to think about a different question there's been relatively little time spent thinking about, which is the day after in the West Bank. That is the day after President Mahmoud Abbas leaves office. To answer that question, can you tell us who Mahmoud Abbas is and what Palestinians think about his presidency?
Yeah, I mean, Mahmoud Abbas is he holds two titles. He's the president of the Palestinian Authority, and he's also the head of the PLO, which is the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO is the main international body. We could call it the international address of the Palestinian national movement. The PLO sits at the United Nations under the banner of the State of Palestine, since it was recognized as a non-member state. He is one of the founding leaders of the Fatah movement that has controlled the PLO for most of the last, actually all of the last 50 plus years, going back to 1969. And he's quite old himself. He's part of that founding generation. I think initially there was a lot of, when he first came to power in 2005, there was a lot of hope that he would be a reformer, that he would be less authoritarian than his predecessor Yasser Arafat, and that he would be able to lead Palestinians to eventual statehood. And he was very much focused on an agenda of negotiations and diplomacy and cooperation with Israel and with the United States in order to achieve that goal. Since then, he's become increasingly unpopular. I think his agenda has been shown to be a total failure. One of the reasons that Hamas has been able to succeed in capturing the hearts and minds of so many Palestinians is all they have to do is point to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority leadership and say, look what's happening in the West Bank. Look at those guys. They jumped through all the hoops. They played by all the rules, and they still get nothing, and are also even delegitimized in Israel and even in Washington. So diplomacy doesn't work because Israel only understands the language of force. That is, so goes the logic, right? And Hamas has been able to capitalize really not on any of its own achievements, but almost entirely on the failure of their primary opponents. So now Mahmoud Abbas is extremely unpopular. He has been unpopular for a long time, but particularly since the attack on Gaza began. There's real animosity and anger directed at him, in particular because he's seen as ineffective, even obsolete, irrelevant in what's happening. He's unable to really do anything to stop the carnage in Gaza, and that irrelevance, I think, has never been more clear.
What is the PA's mandate exactly? I mean, it was founded during the Oslo peace process. What was it designed to do?
So the Palestinian Authority, it depends on who you ask. They're part of the reasons. One of the reasons that Oslo failed is that there were different visions of what the Oslo's provisions meant. The Palestinian Authority being one of them, and for Palestinians, it was supposed to be the embryo for a future Palestinian state, to build up the governing institutions and security apparatus and the bureaucracy for a future Palestinian state. And the expectation was that little by little, Israel would hand over more and more control over occupied territory to the Palestinian Authority. That never quite happened. The process was frozen very early on in 1998, and the PLO really has jurisdiction, direct control in only about 19% of the West Bank. From the Israeli standpoint, the people who signed Oslo did not necessarily envision the Palestinian Authority becoming a state, but they viewed it more as a kind of permanent autonomy. Palestinians would be able to govern themselves, have their own schools, have their own garbage collectors, their own local police. But sovereignty was not really an issue, was not on the table for Yitzhak Rabin or most of his successors. I mean, there are a handful of exceptions who did support a Palestinian state. Ehud Olmert, for example, in the mid-2000s, I think genuinely supported the idea of a Palestinian state. And there were others in the coalition at various moments who did. But for the most part, most Israeli governments over the past 20 years especially have been opposed to the idea of Palestinian statehood. And that's where the process has completely fallen apart.
So looking past this foundational misalignment in values during the Oslo process, what's gone wrong for the PA? I mean, there are a million different ways to answer this question, but if you could first start with the PA's own governance failures. I mean, you mentioned that Abbas's predecessor, Yasser Arafat, ruled Palestinian governance institutions as a bit of an authoritarian. How has Abbas ruled the PLO and the PA?
Well, let's separate between the PA and the PLO. Abbas's rule, I think, as I said, people expected him to be a reformer, and he was initially talking a very reform-minded game early on when he was first prime minister under Yasser Arafat, and then later after Arafat's death, he was elected president. Now, both of them were democratically elected. Yasser Arafat in 1996 won in free and fair elections a very sizable majority of the votes, and that was expected. He's the grandfather of the Palestinian National Movement, so that's no surprise. Mahmoud Abbas was elected with a respectable majority of his own in 2006. The problem has been there are issues of corruption and human rights abuses and governance problems within the Palestinian Authority that are endemic, but also the nature of the peace process, the nature of the Oslo process has essentially required them to be so. Oslo has been obsessively focused on security, namely Israel's security, not necessarily security for Palestinians. And so you have a highly securitized authority that exists in the West Bank, and if you're going to the whole mission really of Palestinian security forces were to crack down on opposition to Oslo and to the peace process and people who might engage in violence against Israel and the occupation. So it has had to become quite authoritarian because it is by nature heavily securitized. If you look at the budget, the PA's budget is hugely disproportionate. Amounts are allocated to security, I think well over 25%. I mean, if you imagine any country with any state whose national budget consisted of 25% of, their military consisted of 25% of their overall budget, that would be absurd, really, in the context of an independent state. Most states, it kind of hovers anywhere between 3 to maybe 9 or 12%. I think the United States is in the low teens. So it's heavily securitized, and there's a culture that Oslo changed the incentive structure for Palestinian governance, whereby the leadership had to be more responsive to the donors, to the United States, to Israel, and donor countries than to its own people. There was always that tension. People don't like, for example, security cooperation with Israel. They see it as a form of collaboration. But that is a pillar of the Oslo process. So that tension between the desires and needs of the population that they're supposed to serve and the external actors who are essentially bankrolling the PA has made the PA necessarily undemocratic.
Yeah, just to drill down on that point about tension, I mean, it seems like the PA, its mandate is to create a secure environment, to create the conditions for an eventual peace. But by doing so, they give Palestinians the impression that the PA is essentially an extension of the Israeli security apparatus that Palestinians have come to loathe, right?
Right. Over time, that has definitely eroded its legitimacy because take the situation in the West Bank, where settlers can rampage through Palestinian villages and towns. They can kill people. They burn down crops and burn down houses. And the PA is not allowed to do anything. They're not allowed to arrest or come anywhere near Israeli settlers. And they have to wait for Israeli soldiers to come in and rescue them. The PA's primary function is to protect Israelis rather than their own people, because they're forbidden from doing that, unless it's Palestinian criminals against other Palestinians, right? Then that's the only place where the PA has jurisdiction. So that basic contradiction really eroded the not just the PA but the whole process, its legitimacy.
So beyond that basic contradiction, there are also more explicit ways that we've learned the Israel government has tried to degrade and erode the PA's legitimacy. There's been some reporting recently from the Israeli newspaper Haaretz and others that have shown that it's actually been a matter of Israeli policy to undermine the PA in order to prevent its viability as the governor of a sovereign Palestinian state. How have they done that?
Well, in lots of ways. There are many sanctions that have been put in place against the PA. For example, when the leadership decided to go to the UN in 2011 and 12 and seek full membership for the state of Palestine, or recognition of the state of Palestine, Israel would withhold its tax revenues that it collects from Palestinians and holds them in escrow and is supposed to disperse them to the PA. And that makes up a major portion of the PA's budget, almost 2/3. So Israel can turn on and off that lever whenever they feel like it. And they have done that quite frequently if they don't like the decisions being made by the leadership.
We've seen that recently. We've seen that as of this week with the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, withholding Palestinian tax revenues as punishment.
Right. Right, and then there's the leadership in Israel is also fairly regularly delegitimizing the Palestinian Authority as enablers of terrorism and as involved in terrorism, and sort of constantly undercutting them. A lot of it is talking points and rhetoric, but it's quite effective because it also affects how the United States responds to the Palestinian Authority. And so there's a lot of those ways that are used to delegitimize and these are the good guys, right? These are supposedly the good Palestinians that everyone wants Israel to deal with and expects an agreement to be reached with them as a negotiating partner. There are two separate authorities, one in Gaza, one in the West Bank. The goal was always to keep both of them kind of weak but not collapsing, slightly off kilter, just enough to keep them dependent on the status quo, and but ruling out any possibility of unification. That was a pillar of Netanyahu's approach to the Palestinians for the past 15 or so years. Keeping Hamas in power, satisfied, but also weakened. So there was the blockade imposed on Gaza, but they would also allow cash flows from Qatar, for example, to go into Gaza, so that to keep things from completely falling apart.
Why does this matter? I mean, for people that would like to see this conflict resolved, which I like to think is the vast majority of us, why is it important that there's a viable, nonviolent political movement in the Palestinian polity?
Well, obviously, you need a coherent, unitary political entity for the achievement of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. So that's a prerequisite, right? You can't have two separate authorities. You don't know who to negotiate with, and you don't know which one is supposed to become the successor to a or the lead to a Palestinian state. And so the idea of keeping Palestinians divided was precisely to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And it was largely acquiesced in by the United States and the Western world, even though they all support a two-state solution. They were either reluctant to press Israel on it, or kind of bought into the ostensible reasons that it was necessary. That the PA is supporting terror, or Hamas, of course, is a terrorist organization. So all these reasons to go along with Israel's kind of divide and rule scenario, but it certainly was not conducive toward a two-state outcome. Keeping Palestinians divided and weak is the opposite of a two-state solution.
Today's episode is sponsored by Millennium Space Systems. Millennium Space Systems, a Boeing company, is a small satellite prime delivering high-performance constellation solutions for the national security space. Founded in 2001, the company's active production lines and 80% vertical integration enable the rapid delivery of small satellites across missions and orbits. Check out the show notes to learn more. Khaled, we're really on the clock here. I know we're on the clock for our conversation, but we're really on the clock here in figuring out how to create a more viable Palestinian Authority, because the fact is Mahmoud Abbas is aged 88 now. Okay, happy birthday, Mahmoud Abbas. There isn't much time before we might be faced with the question of what comes after Abbas. He's led the organization for 18 years. Or the authority for 18 years. We don't know what might come after him. What can the U.S. and presumably Israel, now that it hopefully sees the folly of undermining the PA, what can they do in the next few weeks and months to boost the PA's credibility?
To be honest with you, I don't think there's anything that can be done to rescue Mahmoud Abbas and his legitimacy personally as a leader. I think he is a spent force. I don't even think he has the imagination or foresight to continue to lead, given the enormous challenge now that exists, right? That's compounded by the destruction and death happening in Gaza. So he wasn't up to the task before this catastrophe, and he's certainly not going to be up to the task afterwards. So I don't think there's any way to rehabilitate his leadership. It's really a question of who or what comes after him and whether it can be better than what Palestinians have now. And that's anyone's guess.
Do you imagine that it would be led by someone in Fatah, in Abbas's political party?
It's possible. I mean, I think likely. But which Fatah? There are multiple factions of Fatah. And that's part of the problem. One of the reasons why Mahmoud Abbas canceled elections that were supposed to happen in 2021, precisely because there were at least three different factions of Fatah, and they were going to likely split their vote, and that would have meant a Hamas victory in all likelihood.
Which is a scenario that Israel would probably not countenance.
Oh, correct. Nor would the United States, and that's even more true now. That said, Hamas is a part of the social and political fabric of Palestinian society, and it is not going to be eradicated completely. Of course, it will be diminished greatly, maybe even have its entire leadership wiped out, and its bureaucracy, and certainly its weapons. But it is not going to be ended as a movement. There will always be people who come to the fore because it's really there's an ideological demand for something like Hamas, given their, on the one hand, their Muslim Brotherhood Islamist ideology, but also their focus on resistance. As long as there's an occupation, as long as there's oppression and apartheid and blockade, then you will have necessarily armed groups who resist it. They could be called Hamas, they could be called Hamas 2.0, they could be called something else. But the demand for something like Hamas will exist as long as there is an occupation that is in place and that is enforced through violence, right? Occupation isn't a benign construct. It is a systematized violence and coercion, and relies on repression as a tool to sustain itself. It is essentially a military dictatorship. So as long as that persists, there will be Hamas or something like Hamas.
Khaled, last question. You've been so generous with your time, but hoping to leave on an optimistic note. Is there a third way here? Palestinians, there so many are young people. Do they see an alternative to the Hamas-Fatah paradigm? There
is a growing demand among Palestinians, especially the youth, who are fed up with both Fatah and Hamas, who see both of their programs as having failed quite catastrophically, I would add. And there is a desire. There have been a number of initiatives. Some are even called the third way. There's a real desire there to move beyond those two dominant political forces in Palestinian politics, and I think it's certainly possible, but we're looking at probably a generational struggle. It's not something that's going to happen in the next year or two or five, maybe, but in the medium to long term, we can expect people maybe to move in that direction. But a lot of that depends on the two pressing questions that face Palestinians now. What is the future of Hamas as a political military force? And what is the future of Fatah post Mahmoud Abbas's departure, which is also imminent, right? I mean, he could leave the scene at any moment. And so once once those questions are being answered, then we'll know a lot more about whether a third way is feasible and what shape it might take.
Well, Khaled, we're in a war now. I think all of us would like to see progress made towards peace, but there's a wide gulf between where we are now and where we want to get to. And I think this is an important first step, is finding political partners on both sides, in Israel and in Palestine, that are willing and able to get there. So thanks so much for helping us understand this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. The history and the description of events you just heard is not exhaustive. As with all things in this conflict, there will be listeners who might find it contentious. But if you remember one thing from this conversation, let it be this. The only viable resolution to this conflict, ultimately, even if we're in a time of war, will be a political one. And for political solutions to emerge, you need good partners. Hamas is obviously not a good partner. So that leaves it to other parties, the Israeli government, of course, and a legitimate, popular Palestinian organization to come to the table to make peace. Who will be that partner for peace in the Israeli government? I do not believe that there is one in the existing coalition. And who will be that partner for peace among the Palestinians? It hasn't been Mahmoud Abbas, and that's not entirely his fault, as Khaled said, but it doesn't change the fact that it's not Mahmoud Abbas. So who is it? This war will be long, it will continue to be bloody and horrible, but one day it will stop, and we need to prepare for the day after. In the meantime, I'm Ethan Plotkin. See you on Tuesday.